Right. Let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a deep dive into one of the most challenging and just historically weighty relationships in modern history,
Hmm.
the dynamic between India and Pakistan.
hmm
Think about it. Two nations born from the same moment, really, out of a shared colonial past, yet their entire existence, it feels like, has been defined by that division and the complex legacy of that shared history.
Yeah, it's like every single interaction, every border point, every flicker of hope or, despair seems to carry this immense burden of 1947 and everything that's happened since then.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here, and what our sources really seem to emphasize, is just how inseparable that history is from the present reality of their relationship. It's not some distant past. It feels like a continuous force shaping perceptions and actions on both sides.
Absolutely. It's right there constantly.
And to get a clearer picture of this, we've been immersing ourselves in some key source material, specifically excerpts from a text on international relations that focuses pretty intently on India's relationship with Pakistan.
Yeah, this source gives a really detailed look, doesn't it? At the historical roots, the key flashpoints, the persistent disagreements, right from the very beginning.
It does. It offers this narrative that traces the path from those foundational moments right through to the complex challenges we still see today. Lays out the events, the different perspectives involved.
And it doesn't shy away from some controversial interpretations, as presented in the text.
No, it doesn't. So our mission today is to take this material, this stack of sources, and really extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight for you. We want to help you cut through the noise, get informed on the defining moments, the core dynamics of India-Pakistan relations.
And really understand why things are the way they are,
Yeah.
without feeling totally overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information. It's a lot.
It is a lot. It's about understanding the essential story, the critical turns, and
Right.
what they tell us about this, well, this enduring rivalry.
Their core thread.
So where better to start than right at the very beginning?
The birth of these two nations. Our source material makes it really clear this wasn't some gradual evolution. It was a deliberate, legislated event.
Right.
India and Pakistan were created as two independent sovereign dominions in mid-August 1947. It was a specific law passed by the British Parliament that granted independence and, crucially, divided what was then British India.
And the initial plan, as the source points out, was for both to remain within the British Commonwealth, although they had the option to decide otherwise later on. So the framework for their separation was really set by the departing British power.
Yes, and crucially, the very concept of Pakistan, according to the source we're looking at, was fundamentally rooted in what's called the two-nation theory.
Okay.
The Muslim League, led by M.A. Jinnah, basically insisted that Hindus and Muslims weren't just one community, but constituted two separate nations.
Two distinct nations.
Exactly, each requiring its own state. This, the source argues, was the foundational idea, the justification for carving out Pakistan.
But, I mean, that theory wasn't universally accepted, was it? Even back then.
Oh, far from it. The source notes that the Indian National Congress, that is, the vast majority of people in India, did not subscribe to that idea. They didn't see religion as the defining characteristic of nationhood.
Their vision was different.
Yeah, they envisioned a united, independent India that would encompass all communities. However, the source states, and this is its interpretation, that the British government required the Congress to accept Pakistan as a, quote, bitter pill.
Why? Why did they have to accept it?
Primarily, the source says, to avoid the potential for widespread bloodshed threatened by Jinnah's call for direct action, which, tragically, did lead to terrible violence. So partition was accepted under immense pressure, a really difficult compromise made in the hope, perhaps, of preventing an even greater human cost.
So this wasn't just lines on a map. It was the rapid division of a territory that, for centuries, had shared geography, history, economy.
And the source describes this abrupt, kind of arbitrary division as inherently leading to a certain level of, well, disharmony. It was almost inevitable, given how unified the territory had been.
And the source goes further than just disharmony, doesn't it? It talks about the initial attitudes.
It does. It characterizes the initial attitude of Pakistan as perceived from the Indian side described in the text, not just as disharmony, but using the source's words as hatred for India and call for jihad.
Wow. Strong words.
Very strong. And the source contrasts this directly with what it portrays as India's stated desire to live in peace with its new neighbor. That perceived difference in starting attitudes is a really significant claim presented in the material we have.
Okay, so Beyond the division of British India itself, there was another huge layer of complexity right away. The princely states.
Absolutely massive.
Yeah.
You had over 500 of these native or princely states ruled by princes, maharajas, nawabs under what was called British paramountcy.
Right.
When British rule ended, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 stipulated that this paramountcy would just lapse. It would disappear.
Leaving the rulers with a choice.
Exactly. A critical choice.
Yeah.
Accede to India, accede to Pakistan, or, and this was the really dangerous part, potentially try to remain independent.
And Sardar Patel, India's home minister at the time, he played a central, really decisive role here, didn't he?
Oh, absolute central. The source highlights his use of, well, a combination of methods. Persuasion, definitely, but also at times coercion to secure the merger of, I think the number is 567 states with the new Indian Union.
Okay, 567 into India. What about the others?
5 states joined Pakistan, but 3 really significant states, Junagadh, Hyderabad, and maybe most famously Jammu and Kashmir, they failed to decide by the deadline.
And immediately became flashpoints.
Huge flashpoints in the very nascent India-Pakistan relationship.
Okay, let's look at those early challenges then, maybe starting with Junagadh.
Sure. Junagadh was located in the Kathiawar region, modern-day Gujarat. It had a Muslim ruler, the Nawab, but the population was predominantly Hindu.
And the source gives a rather colorful description of the Nawab.
It does, yeah. It describes him as, quote, fun-loving and suggesting he prioritized his own pleasure over the welfare of his people. A pretty critical view presented there.
Definitely brings the historical figure to life, as the source sees him. So he delayed his decision.
He did. And eventually he chose to join Pakistan.
Okay. But how did Pakistan react?
Well, according to the source, Pakistan's enthusiasm was kind of limited, mainly because Junagadh was geographically isolated. It was completely surrounded by Indian territory.
Ah, so impractical.
Very impractical. And as the situation within Junagadh apparently became quite anarchic, India intervened militarily. The Nawab fled to Pakistan, and his chief minister, the Diwan, requested the state's merger with India.
And was there any confirmation of what the people wanted?
Yes, to confirm the people's will, a plebiscite was held in February 1948. The source notes an absolutely overwhelming majority voted for the merger with India. Only 91 votes against, it says.
So a clear result. Did Pakistan accept it?
They tried, unsuccessfully, to take the issue to the international stage. But the source points out something else interesting about Junagadh. It argues that the Junagadh situation, while a failure for Pakistan in itself, provided Pakistan with a kind of narrative opportunity. It allowed Pakistan to accuse India of using force.
Right.
And, importantly, according to the source's interpretation, to begin preparing its strategy for intervention in Jammu and Kashmir.
Ah, okay, because J&K was different.
Very different scenario, as the source highlights. Unlike Junagadh or Hyderabad, J&K had a Muslim-majority population, but was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja. Pakistan felt this situation aligned much better with its two-nation theory claims.
Got it. So next up, Hyderabad, another big challenge.
Huge challenge. Hyderabad was a very large, very wealthy state right in the heart of South India. And unlike Junagadh, it was completely surrounded by Indian territory after all the other provinces and states had integrated. Its ruler, the Nizam, was apparently one of the world's wealthiest individuals at the time.
And the source mentions he had ambitions of his own.
Yes. His dream, according to the source, was for an independent kingdom. Though it also says he gave the impression of favoring Pakistan. It even notes he provided a significant loan, 2 crore rupees, to Pakistan.
Interesting. What was Jinnah's view on Hyderabad, according to the source?
Apparently, Jinnah didn't seem to push strongly for Hyderabad's accession to Pakistan. He reportedly viewed it more as the Nizam's own concern to sort out.
So, similar to Junagadh in having a Muslim ruler over a large Hindu majority, but Pakistan's initial approach was different.
Seemingly so, yes. The Nizam pursued sovereignty, but also negotiated with India. And the source mentions he reportedly had an indication from Pakistan that he could rely on their support if needed.
But then the situation there got much worse, didn't it? With the rise of the Razakars.
It deteriorated dramatically. The source describes the Razakars as an organization of, quote, Muslim fundamentalists who were trained to fight. And it says they let loose a reign of terror, killing, looting, causing a complete collapse of law and order.
That must have created immense pressure in India.
Exactly. This reported reign of terror led to widespread public demand within India for the use of force to restore peace and order in Hyderabad.
And the source gives a specific detail about how the Indian government finally decided to act, doesn't it?
It does. It mentions that police action had apparently been planned several times before but wasn't carried out. The fifth such plan, codenamed Operation Polo, was drafted and implemented under the direct control of Home Minister Sardar Patel
And Nehru.
The source adds, quite notably, that Prime Minister Nehru was reportedly not informed beforehand for fear he might disapprove. It really highlights Patel's independent and decisive role in handling this particular integration, according to the source.
And was the operation quick?
Remarkably so, according to the source. The Indian Army brought the situation under control very quickly, reportedly within 24 hours, with the whole task completed in about 5 days.
And then Hyderabad acceded.
India accepted the Nizam's formal request for accession, and they agreed to pay him a significant privy purse annually. Pakistan, as the source notes, termed India's action aggression and raised the issue at the UN multiple times.
But didn't get much traction.
Not really, no. Couldn't muster significant support beyond perhaps the United States at that time.
Okay, so 2 of the 3 big undecided states were integrated into India, though not without conflict and international arguments. But there was another huge immediate issue right after partition, the problem of displaced persons and minorities.
Oh, immense. A direct and absolutely tragic consequence of the partition violence. The source details that immediately after 1947, large-scale riots broke out in Pakistan, forcing Hindus and Sikhs to flee for their lives.
Leaving everything behind.
Everything. They lost property, many were killed or wounded, possessions looted, and the source explicitly mentions women being raped and kidnapped. Just horrific accounts.
And this violence had repercussions in India too, didn't it?
Terrible repercussions. It led to anti-Muslim riots in some areas of India. However, the source draws a distinction here, which is important to note as the source's perspective.
What's the distinction?
It states, the government of India took strong measures to check the violence and provide maximum security to the Muslim minority who remained in India, whereas, it claims, the government of Pakistan failed miserably in protecting its non-Muslim minorities.
That's a strong claim.
It is. The source uses the chilling detail that even trainloads of dead bodies arrived in India from Pakistan, which understandably caused a very strong reaction in India.
So both countries faced a massive refugee crisis, but was it symmetrical?
According to the source, no. It notes India faced a larger-scale rehabilitation problem. It apparently took almost 15 years to fully rehabilitate the millions who arrived needing jobs, financial aid, housing, just basic necessities.
And tied to this was the issue of property left behind.
Huge issue. Evacuee property, houses, shops, factories, bank accounts, movable and immovable assets left by refugees on both sides. The source highlights what it calls a significant discrepancy here.
What was the discrepancy?
It claims Hindus and Sikhs left property valued in the thousands of crores of rupees in Pakistan, while the evacuee property left by Muslims in India was valued significantly less, maybe only around 300 crores. So the problem was financially more acute in India, according to this source. And despite talks, no worthwhile solution was ever found for this property issue.
There's also a direct financial settlement between the governments, right?
Yes, part of the partition arrangements.
Right.
India was supposed to make a cash payment of Rs 55 crores to Pakistan.
And Pakistan.
Pakistan, in turn, was supposed to provide a credit of Rs 300 crores to India within 5 years. The source notes that Pakistan did not fulfill this commitment.
And there's a famous story involving Mahatma Gandhi related to India's payment.
There is. The source recounts that Mahatma Gandhi undertook a fast and a death in late 1947, partly, it says, to compel the Nehru government to release that Rs 55 crores to Pakistan, which had perhaps been held up due to the ongoing conflict and tensions.
And Nehru's government did release it.
Yes. Nehru himself is quoted in the source, stating that making the payment was in accordance with India's high ideals and Gandhi's moral principles. A very significant moment.
Okay, another crucial early issue, but one that actually was eventually resolved, was the sharing of river waters.
Yes, the Indus waters. Undivided Punjab was known as the land of 5 rivers, and its extensive irrigation network made it incredibly fertile, the granary of India. Partition, however, literally cut through these rivers.
How did the division work out geographically?
The Ravi, Sutlej, and Beas, the eastern rivers, ended up mainly in India, while the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab, the western rivers, were mostly in Pakistan.
But the infrastructure, the canals and headworks was key.
Absolutely. The source points out that 20 out of 25 major canals irrigating territory that became Pakistan actually received their water from headworks located in what was now India.
So India had significant control.
Potentially, yes. The source makes a point of stating that India could have, theoretically, used all this water, which could have turned Pakistani Punjab into a desert. But, it adds, India never had such evil intentions.
But sharing still became a major problem.
Oh, definitely. An initial standstill agreement, where India supplied water and Pakistan paid for it, lapsed on March 31st, 1948. Because, according to the source, Pakistan failed to renew it.
Leading to disputes.
Yes. A fresh agreement was made in May 1948, involving a progressive diminution of water supply by India. India, needing water for its own growing needs, had to build major projects like the Bhakra Dam.
And Pakistan's reaction.
In August 1950, Pakistan unilaterally repudiated the 1948 agreement, claiming it had been signed under duress. This breakdown led to mediation efforts by the World Bank, starting in 1951, spearheaded by its president, Eugene Blake.
And this mediation, unusually perhaps, succeeded.
It did, eventually. It led to the Indus Waters Treaty, signed in September 1960 by India's Prime Minister Nehru and Pakistan's President Ayub Khan. A real landmark agreement.
What were the key terms?
It provided for a 10-year transition period. During this time, India would continue supplying progressively diminishing amounts of water from the eastern rivers, Ravi, Sutlej, Beas, to Pakistan.
And after the transition?
After the 10 years, extendable by 3 at Pakistan's request, India would have unrestricted use of the eastern rivers, and Pakistan would have unrestricted use of the western rivers, Indus, Jhelum, Chenab. India also agreed to provide significant financial assistance to Pakistan to build link canals to place the water from the eastern rivers.
A comprehensive solution.
Seemingly so. The treaty was implemented starting January 1961, and the dispute was considered amicably settled. Nehru reportedly called it a memorable event.
It really stands out, doesn't it? An instance where international mediation and sustained negotiation actually led to a lasting working agreement between the two.
It really does, especially when you contrast it with other unresolved issues. And that, of course, brings us to the third major flashpoint from the partition era, and arguably the most enduring, most intractable source of conflict, Jammu and Kashmir.
Ah, Kashmir. Described in the source quite poetically as heaven on earth, but also this vast territory, over 86,000 square miles, that has been the primary cause of hostile relations since 1947.
J&K was unique among those undecided states. It had, as we mentioned, a predominantly Muslim population, but was ruled by a Hindu Maharaja, Hari Singh. The source really highlights the Maharaja's indecision both before and immediately after August 15, 1947.
He didn't join either country right away.
No. He didn't accede to India or Pakistan. Instead, he concluded what was called a standstill agreement with Pakistan, basically to maintain existing arrangements for things like trade and communication. India, notably, did not accept a similar agreement. The Maharaja's initial preference, according to the source, was actually independence.
But Pakistan didn't just wait.
No, the source says Pakistan began building pressure, notably by stopping essential supplies to the state. And then, immediately before the tribal invasion, a Pakistani Foreign Office official reportedly visited Kashmir, trying again to persuade Hari Singh to join Pakistan.
And the Maharaja refused.
Refused to make a hasty decision, yes.
And then came the invasion. The sources are very clear about the timing here, aren't they?
Extremely clear. The aggression began on October 22, 1947. It was carried out by tribesmen from the northwestern frontier province of Pakistan, but the source describes them as well-trained and well-equipped. They advanced rapidly, reaching Baramulla, which is only about 25 miles from Srinagar, the capital, within 5 days.
And the Maharaja's accession to India?
The sources are absolutely emphatic on this point. It was only after this aggression began, after the invasion was well underway, that a reportedly nervous Maharaja Hari Singh signed the instrument of accession to India.
So he asked for India's help after signing the accession document.
Precisely. He pleaded with India to accept the accession immediately and send forces to repel the attack. The source quotes him, admitting he only had 2 alternatives: let the aggressors loot and kill, or join India. He pleaded for immediate acceptance.
And India accepted.
India accepted the accession, and troops were airlifted in by October 27th. However, India attached a crucial condition, a caveat, to its acceptance.
What was that?
That after the aggression was vacated, after the invaders were pushed out, the wishes of the people of Kashmir would be ascertained on the question of accession. Lord Mountbatten, the Governor-General, explicitly mentioned this promise of a reference to the people in his letter accepting the accession.
How did Pakistan react to the accession?
Predictably, they refused to accept it. Pakistan's Prime Minister Liaquat Ali Khan is quoted in the source calling it a fraud perpetrated on the people of Kashmir by its cowardly ruler with the aggressive help of the government of India.
Interesting framing.
Yes, and the source itself comments on what it sees as the irony of the aggressors calling the victims' request for help aggression. The Indian army began pushing back the invaders, but their retreat was apparently slow, reportedly due to help and supplies coming from Pakistan. India, not wanting an open war with Pakistan at this stage, decided to take the issue to the United Nations.
So, January 1st, 1948, India goes to the UN Security Council.
That's right. Under Article 35 of the UN Charter, which deals with situations likely to endanger international peace, India sought the UN's assistance specifically to have the Pakistan-supported aggression vacated. India explicitly charged Pakistan with committing an act of aggression against India.
And Pakistan's response at the UN.
Pakistan denied the charges, framed its own countercharges against India, and declared Kashmir's accession to India illegal.
Meanwhile, on the ground, Pakistan consolidated control over the territory held by the invaders.
Yes. They installed what the source calls a so-called Azad Kashmir government in that occupied territory. Pakistan continues to refer to this area as Azad Kashmir and insists it's independent, though administered by Pakistan. Around the same time, Sheikh Abdullah became the Prime Minister of Jammu and Kashmir on the Indian side in March 1948.
During these early UN Security Council discussions, Pakistan's PM Liaquat Ali Khan apparently expressed willingness to accept a plebiscite, but under certain conditions.
Yes, but the conditions were key. The source says India found them totally unacceptable. These conditions included the withdrawal of all Indian troops, the immobilization of the J&K state forces, the formation of a coalition government that included representatives from the Azad Kashmir side, and then an internationally supervised plebiscite.
So deadlock right from the start.
Pretty much. The source states, quite starkly, thus began a never-ending conflict between India and Pakistan.
And the source offers a really strong critical assessment of India's original offer of a plebiscite, doesn't it?
It does. It calls the decision by Nehru's government to offer a plebiscite in the first place a serious mistake. It goes on to state that this decision has been responsible for prolonged dispute, occasional border clashes, and terrorist attacks.
That's a significant claim.
It is. This source even notes that thousands of Jawans and civilians have been killed even after the formal ceasefire on January 1, 1949, implying, from its perspective, that the plebiscite offer itself prolonged the instability and conflict rather than resolving it.
The UN Security Council appointed a commission, UNCIP, to mediate. What did they recommend?
UNCIP made recommendations in December 1948. The core idea was a sequenced process for demilitarization leading to a plebiscite.
Sequence being the key word.
Absolutely. First, Pakistan had to withdraw its troops, the tribesmen, and any Pakistani nationals from J&K as soon as possible after a ceasefire. Second, the territory vacated by Pakistan would be administered by local officials under the supervision of the UN Commission. Third, after those first two steps were fulfilled and India was informed by the Commission, then India would withdraw the bulk of its forces, leaving only a limited number necessary for maintaining law and order.
Did both sides accept this?
Pakistan accepted the proposals after some initial reluctance, according to the source. A ceasefire agreement was signed and became effective at midnight on January 1, 1949, ending the First India-Pakistan War.
But the plebiscite, the final step, never happened. Why not?
Because, crucially, according to the source's interpretation, the very first condition, Pakistan withdrawing its forces from the territory it occupied, was never fulfilled. Pakistan never vacated the area now known as POK or Azad Kashmir.
And the source has a view on the timing of the ceasefire.
Yes. It notes that the Indian Army was making gains and could potentially have liberated the entire state if the ceasefire had been delayed a bit longer, implying perhaps that the ceasefire saved Pakistan from a more complete defeat in that first round.
So the fighting stopped and a line was drawn.
Yes, a ceasefire line was drawn based on where the fighting ended. This was later formalized in July 1949 and eventually became known as the Line of Control, LODC. It left about a third of the original J&K state's territory, roughly 32,000 square miles, with about 7 lakh population at the time, under Pakistan's control.
And subsequent UN efforts to break the deadlock also failed.
They did. Numerous mediators and proposals followed over the next few years, people like General MacNaughton, Sir Owen Dixon, Frank Graham. They all tried to find a formula for demilitarization that both sides could agree on as a prerequisite for the plebiscite.
But they all hit the same wall.
Essentially, yes. The core disagreement remained. India refused to withdraw the bulk of its forces from what it considered its own sovereign territory, while Pakistani forces remained in occupation of a part of it. Pakistan, on the other hand, insisted on the withdrawal of all Indian forces alongside its own.
The source mentions Sir Owen Dixon's findings.
Yes, Dixon, appointed by the SE in 1950, actually acknowledged that the entry of tribesmen and later the Pakistani army into Kashmir was a violation of international law. But the source notes critically, even then, he tried to put India-Pakistan at par in his demilitarization proposals, which India rejected. He eventually suggested partition along the ceasefire line with a plebiscite only in the Kashmir Valley, which was unacceptable to India, and recommended direct negotiations.
So by the mid-1950s, the UN track had stalled.
Pretty much suspended, yes. In the meantime, political developments continued within the Indian-administered part of J&K. A constituent assembly was elected by adult franchise.
And what did this assembly do?
In February 1954, it formally ratified the state's accession to India. Then, in November 1956, it adopted a state constitution which explicitly declared Jammu and Kashmir to be an integral part of India. India considered the accession finalized on January 26, 1957, when this constitution came into effect.
This obviously solidified India's legal and political position on the matter.
Absolutely. From India's perspective, the people's wishes had been ascertained through their elected representatives in this constituent assembly. India laid the blame for the plebiscite not happening squarely on Pakistan's refusal to withdraw its troops from POK, arguing India wasn't at fault.
And legally?
Legally, India maintained that the Maharaja's original instrument of accession in 1947 was sufficient and complete in itself. The Indian Independence Act didn't stipulate a plebiscite as a condition for accession. So from India's viewpoint, the only dispute remaining was, and still is, Pakistan's continued occupation of roughly one-third of the original state territory.
The source describes the Kashmir problem as extremely complicated, having no easy solution, and really touches upon the deep ideological stakes involved for both countries.
It really does. It quotes Werner Levi saying, the spiritual foundations of both states are involved.
Yeah.
And it quotes K. Raman Pillai, who explains this ideological battle very clearly.
How does Pillai frame it?
He says that for India, a secular democracy, holding Kashmir, with its Muslim majority integrated into India, is vital proof that Hindus and Muslims can live together peacefully within one nation. It validates India's secular identity.
And for Pakistan?
For Pakistan, an Islamic republic founded on the two-nation theory, possessing Muslim-majority Kashmir, is seen as vital for the fulfillment of that very theory, the idea of a national home for the subcontinent's Muslims.
So more than just territory.
Much more. For both nations, the source concludes Kashmir became, and remains, a critical issue of national prestige and identity.
Okay, let's quickly outline Pakistan's main arguments for claiming Kashmir as presented in the source material.
Right. Primarily, the argument stems directly from the two-nation theory. As a Muslim-majority state, Kashmir's natural place, according to this view, is with Pakistan.
What else?
They also initially cited the sources of major rivers like the Indus, Jhelum, and Chenab being in Kashmir, claiming these were vital for Pakistani agriculture. Though the source itself notes this argument lost much of its validity after the 1960 Indus Waters Treaty resolved the water sharing.
Any other points?
Economic dependence was another argument that Kashmir's economy historically relied on trade routes and markets in areas that became Pakistan. The source deems this equally untenable. And finally, arguments about geographical proximity and strategic or military importance, claiming Kashmir is closer to Pakistan and vital for its defense. The source dismisses these as absurd or untenable if applied generally.
And how does the source summarize India's rejection of these arguments?
India's position is firm, according to the source.
Yeah.
First and foremost, India never accepted the two-nation theory. Its commitment is to secularism, where religion is not the basis of nationhood. It argues that partition involved forced migration and violence, not a voluntary transfer of populations based solely on religion. If religion were the basis, the source asks rhetorically, why did millions of Muslims choose to remain in India? India totally rejects religion as the basis for states.
So, rejecting the ideological foundation of Pakistan's claim?
Exactly. It dismisses the other arguments about geography, economy, and military dependence as untenable. India maintains that the problem was created by the Maharaja's indecision and Pakistan's aggression, not by any Indian desire to grab Kashmir. The source even notes that figures like Mountbatten and Patel were reportedly okay initially with Kashmir voluntarily joining Pakistan had it happened peacefully and legally.
So India's bottom line remains.
The sole point of dispute is Pakistan's continued occupation of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, POK.
This deep ideological battleground and the unresolved territorial dispute really set the stage for decades of tension, didn't they? Let's move into how these dynamics evolved and led up to the 1965 war.
A really key development, as the source highlights, was Pakistan's decision in the mid-1950s to join Western military alliances.
See it, the Baghdad Pact.
Right, including a direct military pact with the United States in 1954. From the U.S. perspective, this was primarily about containing communism during the Cold War.
But India had concerns about the weapons Pakistan was receiving.
Major concerns. The U.S. reportedly assured India that the weapons supplied to Pakistan under these pacts were intended only for defense against potential communist aggression and were not to be used against India.
But the source claims otherwise.
Yes, the source states quite pointedly, in practice, Pakistan used the American weapons only against India. It says India objected strongly to this U.S. military aid, arguing it would inevitably complicate the Kashmir dispute and fuel an arms race, but these objections were apparently brushed aside by the U.S.
So Pakistan's foreign policy became heavily centered on this alliance and its core issue with India.
Absolutely. The source describes Pakistan's main thrust in foreign policy during this period as hatred towards India and seeking Kashmir's accession to Pakistan. It suggests Pakistan judged world affairs largely by how they might support its position on Kashmir.
And this intense focus from Pakistan had a reciprocal impact on India's foreign policy positioning.
It seems so. The source suggests that India's persistent emphasis on the secular basis and policies in its international outreach might have been, quote, largely because of Pakistan and the Kashmir dispute. It quotes Professor V.P. Dutt arguing that while Pakistan saw Kashmir as essential to its identity as an Islamic republic, for India, holding Kashmir was seen as absolutely crucial for the survival of its entire secular system and way of life.
Wow. So the stakes felt existential on both sides, just for different ideological reasons.
Exactly. And the rhetoric remained incredibly heated, with Pakistan constantly challenging India's integration to Kashmir on the international stage.
How so?
Pakistan consistently referred to the J&K Constituent Assembly as a fraud, called India's integration illegal. A Pakistani representative, Feroz Khan Noon, in 1957 even called Kashmir an Indian military base. India, through its diplomats like V.K. Krishna Menon, had to strongly counter this narrative, framing the dispute as Pakistan's act of aggression and constantly reiterating India's secular identity and the fact that India had more Muslim citizens than West Pakistan did at the time.
Beyond the rhetoric and alliances, the source describes Pakistan's strategy as actively aiming to weaken India.
Yes, it characterizes Pakistan's primary foreign policy aim as to beat India, or at least to get even with it. It says Pakistan actively sought foreign intervention when India tried to block it and pursued alliances first with the U.S., then feelers to others, and significantly with China, specifically to keep India weak or off balance.
And the U.S. arms kept flowing.
Pakistan received substantial U.S. military aid, reportedly worth billions, including modern aircraft like Sabre jets and Patton tanks. And the source argues that when the U.S. alliance didn't deliver Pakistan's objectives regarding India and Kashmir, Pakistan welcomed the Chinese embrace, receiving significant economic and military aid from Beijing as well.
The source quotes V.P. Dutt again here.
Yes, on Pakistan's urge for standing on the same mountaintop as India and its continuing crisis of identity, adding an explosive dimension to the relationship.
And then the deterioration of India-China relations in the early 1960s gave Pakistan another perceived opportunity.
A major one. After the 1962 Sino-Indian War, where China occupied parts of Indian territory, including in Ladakh, part of J&K, Pakistan saw a chance to align closely with China against their common rival, India. The source describes this alignment somewhat cynically as between the two opportunistic friends who then started pressuring India.
And China changed its stance on Kashmir.
Significantly, yes. China, which had earlier been somewhat neutral or ambiguous, shifted its stance to support Pakistan's position on Kashmir against India. During the 1962 conflict, the source states Pakistan fully supported China and actively tried to argue internationally that India was in the wrong.
This whole complex web of alliances, rivalries, and the unresolved Kashmir issue then boiled over into an armed clash in 1965, even before the full-scale war, right? In the Rann of Kutch.
Yeah, that's right. The Rann of Kutch is a large salt marsh area on the border between Gujarat in India and Sindh province in Pakistan. It was historically part of the princely state of Kutch, which had acceded to India.
But Pakistan disputed the border.
Yes, Pakistan laid claim to about 3,500 square miles of the northern part of the Rann, arguing it should belong to Sindh. This led to an armed clash in April 1965 when, according to the source, two divisions of the Pakistan Army crossed the border and occupied parts of the Rann. India was reportedly caught somewhat unprepared for this aggression.
Fighting went on for a while.
Yes, until the end of June. It eventually led to mediation by the British Prime Minister at the time, Harold Wilson.
What was the outcome of the mediation?
A ceasefire was agreed upon in June 1965. The agreement stipulated that both armies would withdraw to the positions they held back on January 1st, 1965. And the border dispute itself was referred to an international tribunal with 3 arbitrators.
And the tribunal's decision?
The award came in 1968. It granted about 90% of the disputed territory to India, but awarded about 300 square miles to Pakistan. The source notes this award was criticized within India, but the government implemented it due to the prior commitment made in the 1965 agreement.
And the source makes a point about the weapons used in Kutch.
Yes, it highlights explicitly that during this attack in the Rann of Kutch, the arms supplied to Pakistan by the United States, the Sieto and Cento, were freely used against India, directly contradicting the assurances the U.S. had given.
This perceived violation of assurances, coupled with Pakistan's frustration perhaps from the Kutch ceasefire outcome, reportedly led them to their next, bigger gamble targeting Kashmir directly.
Exactly. This, according to the source, directly triggered the full-scale India-Pakistan War of 1965. The source states this war ultimately proved that India was superior in many respects. Leading up to it, there was an interesting diplomatic shift involving the Soviet Union.
What was that?
The Soviets had shown a more neutral stance during the Kutch crisis than perhaps India expected, and they even invited Pakistani President Ayub Khan for a visit of first in 18 years. Ayub Khan reportedly used the visit to argue that U.S. and Soviet policies were encouraging India. The Soviets under Kosygin were apparently trying to win Pakistan over, blaming Western imperialism for conflict.
How did India react to this Soviet move?
India was concerned, understandably. Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri visited the USSR, seeking continued Soviet support. The Soviets reassured him that improving ties with Pakistan wouldn't harm Indo-Soviet friendship, but the source describes Shastri's visit as not a big diplomatic success. It concludes it was in this background that Pakistan, according to the source, decided to implement its plan to disturb peace and wage war over Kashmir.
And that plan started covertly.
Yes, with large-scale infiltration into Kashmir. Starting in early August 1965, Pakistan sent thousands, the source estimates 3,000 to 5,000 regular Pakistani troops, but dressed in civilian clothes, across the ceasefire line into Indian-administered Kashmir.
What was their objective?
They were reportedly trained in guerrilla warfare, possibly with Chinese assistance, and their aim was to provoke large-scale violence, sabotage the state machinery, try to overthrow the government, and essentially pave the way for a larger invasion by Pakistani regular troops. They were trying to wage what Pakistan framed as a war of independence of Kashmir. Radio Pakistan even made false announcements claiming the people had revolted and key sites were captured.
But the infiltration didn't succeed as planned.
No, the Indian Army took the matter into its hands, engaging the infiltrators, arresting or killing many. Crucially, they located the bases in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir that were supporting these infiltrators.
And India decided to hit those bases.
Yes. India decided it had to capture those bases in POK to stop the infiltration. In August, Indian forces seized key locations like Kargil and Tithwal, and importantly captured the Hajipir Pass, a major infiltration route.
This escalation then led to open war.
It did. The war lasted for 23 days, from early September until a UN Security Council resolution called for a ceasefire on September 20th, which became effective on September 23, 1965. According to the source, Pakistan was essentially forced to accept the ceasefire, as Indian troops were pushing back significantly. The source concludes Pakistani aggression was halted, and its political aspirations were frustrated.
How did the Indian military perform, according to the source?
It says the Indian troops fought valiantly. It makes a special mention of them destroying many of the sophisticated U.S.-supplied Patton tanks, again highlighting the use of these supposedly defensive arms against India. They also captured or knocked out numerous U.S. and China-made weapons used by Pakistan.
What about the cost?
Significant on both sides. The source cites figures of over 2,200 Indian soldiers killed and nearly 8,000 injured, with Pakistani losses estimated even higher at around 5,900 troops. Both sides lost tanks and aircraft.
Was the war decisive?
The source describes the war as not decisive in terms of a total victory, but argues it gave an edge to India and restored her morale, which had been somewhat shaken by the 1962 conflict with China.
What was India's main objective, as seen by the source?
To prove its superiority and destroy as much of Pakistani weaponry as possible. And the source concludes this objective was achieved. The war tired Pakistan. However, it also notes there was dissatisfaction within India about accepting the ceasefire when victory seemed in sight in key sectors like Lahore and Sialkot. The source makes the strong claim that Pakistan was saved of a humiliating defeat. India did end up holding about 750 square miles of Pakistani territory at the time of the ceasefire.
But those territorial gains didn't last, did they? They were reversed by the Tashkent Agreement.
That's right. The Tashkent meeting was a major diplomatic initiative by the Soviet Union, specifically Soviet Premier Kosygin, in January 1966. It brought together India's Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri and Pakistan's President Ayub Khan in Tashkent, Uzbekistan.
A Soviet initiative? That was unusual.
Very unusual at the time. The source notes it was the first time the Soviets had taken the lead in trying to settle a conflict between two non-communist states. And this effort was reportedly blessed by other major powers, except for China. Pakistan, perhaps expecting U.S. intervention during the war, which never happened, eventually accepted the Soviet invitation.
What were the expectations going into Tashkent? Pakistan's Ayub Khan reportedly hoped for a favorable Kashmir settlement.
He did, according to the source, but Shastri's position remained firm. Kashmir's accession was final and not negotiable. It was an integral part of India. The negotiations were apparently very difficult, reportedly on the verge of collapse several times over 6 days.
But they reached an agreement.
Yes, the Tashkent Declaration, signed on January 10, 1966. It contained 9 main points. Key among them were a commitment to restore normal and peaceful relations, reaffirming their UN Charter obligation not to use force and to settle disputes peacefully.
And critically, the withdrawal of troops.
Yes. Point 2 mandated the withdrawal of all armed personnel by February 25, 1966, back to the positions they held before August 5, 1965, essentially restoring the pre-war status quo ante, meaning India gave up the territory it had captured.
What else was in the declaration?
Agreements on non-interference in each other's internal affairs, discouraging hostile propaganda, restoring normal diplomatic relations, resuming economic, trade, communication, and cultural exchanges, and repatriating prisoners of war.
A comprehensive-sounding agreement, but overshadowed by tragedy.
Yes, tragically, Prime Minister Shastri died of a massive heart attack in Tashkent just hours after signing the declaration. A huge shock for India.
How was the Tashkent Declaration received in both countries?
Quite differently, according to the source. In India, it was generally welcomed, albeit tinged with sadness over Shastri's death, with hope for normalization. But in Pakistan, the source states there was a lot of criticism. Many reportedly saw it as a surrender to Indian demands and Soviet pressures. The Pakistani foreign minister at the time, Z.A. Bhutto, was particularly unhappy, finding it hard to reconcile signing an agreement before the Kashmir dispute was settled to Pakistan's satisfaction.
Did the agreement lead to lasting peace? Did the Tashkent spirit hold?
Not really. The source notes the Tashkent spirit began to evaporate fairly soon. Pakistan reportedly kept on arming itself and being violent anti-India propaganda. Z.A. Bhutto is quoted making a particularly harsh outburst about Hindu culture trying to devour Islamic culture.
So despite the agreement,
India reportedly worked hard to implement the terms, and provisions like troop withdrawal and POW repatriation were carried out. But the broader efforts towards building friendship and cooperation did not bear fruits. The source reiterates his view that Pakistan's primary objective remained unchanged, to obtain Kashmir.
So despite the Tashkent Agreement trying to reset things, the underlying hostility and Pakistan's focus on Kashmir persisted, setting the stage again for escalating tensions that would eventually lead to the 1971 war.
Exactly. Pakistan reportedly made strategic moves between 1966 and 1969, specifically to improve its relations with the Soviet Union, possibly aiming to drive a wedge between India and the USSR, or at least neutralize Soviet support for India. Pakistan's President Ayub Khan visited the USSR again in 1968.
Did Pakistan succeed in improving ties with Moscow?
Partially. The Soviets were interested in reducing Pakistan's dependence on the U.S. and China. They agreed in April 1968 to supply some non-lethal weapons to Pakistan.
But this created new tensions with India.
Yes, India believed this Soviet assistance only served to harden Islamabad's attitude. By this time, according to the source, the Tashkent edifice lay in shambles. Pakistan's core view hadn't changed. peace required either Kashmir being settled to its satisfaction or Pakistan achieving military superiority over India.
Were there other specific sources of tension during this period?
Several. Pakistan reached an agreement with China to build and open the Karakoram Highway, linking Gilgit in Pyongyang with China's Xinjiang province. India saw this as an unfriendly and illegal act as it was built on territory India claimed as its own, but was under Pakistani occupation.
And the usual pressure points remained.
Pakistan continued to seek external help from the U.S., the Soviets, China, to pressure India on its Kashmir demands. There were also ongoing disputes over water resources, specifically Pakistan's objections to India constructing the Farakka barrage on the Ganga River, which Pakistan claimed would harm agriculture in what was then East Pakistan by leaving it dry.
Did India try any diplomatic initiatives, like offering a no-war pact again?
Yes, India reportedly suggested a no-war pact again during this period, but Pakistan, under Ayub Khan, reportedly turned down the offer, with Ayub quoted as calling it an attempt by India to hoodwink the world.
And the source mentions Pakistani interference inside India.
It does. It notes India released documents providing evidence of Pakistan's aid and support to Mizo and Naga insurgent groups operating in northeast India, indicating Pakistani efforts to destabilize India internally. Pakistan also apparently succeeded in securing additional military aid from the United States during this time.
This all built up towards the major crisis in East Pakistan in 1971.
Yes, the source notes that India-Pakistan relations reached an all-time low in 1971. The crisis that erupted in East Pakistan led directly to a brutal civil war there, a massive exodus of millions of refugees pouring into India, and ultimately the Third India-Pakistan War in December 1971.
And that war resulted in
the defeat and disintegration of Pakistan as it existed then, and the birth of the independent nation of Bangladesh.
What triggered the crisis in East Pakistan?
It stemmed directly from the results of Pakistan's National Assembly election held in December 1970. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's Awami League Party, based primarily in East Pakistan and campaigning on a 6-point program demanding greater autonomy for the East Wing, won an absolute majority in the National Assembly.
Which should have meant he'd become prime minister.
Exactly. But Pakistan's military president, Yahya Khan, reportedly acting in concert with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, whose party had won in West Pakistan, postponed the scheduled assembly session indefinitely in March 1971. Instead of allowing Mujib to form the government, they arrested him and detained him in West Pakistan.
And the reaction in East Pakistan?
It triggered massive protests and a crackdown. The source describes the Pakistani security forces unleashing unprecedented violence against the Bengali population in East Bengal, including reports of massacres and widespread rape.
This led to the refugee crisis.
A staggering crisis. About 1 crore people, that's 10 million, fled the violence and poured into neighboring India as refugees. This placed an immense, serious burden on Indian economy, and as the source states quite directly, brought India into the picture. Whether India liked it or not, the internal crisis of Pakistan became India's problem too.
The Awami League then declared independence.
Yes, the Awami League, operating underground or from exile, declared the independence of Bangladesh in April 1971. However, initial international recognition was slow.
Even from India.
The source notes that no country formally recognized Bangladesh right away, calling this a success for Pakistani diplomacy at the time. Even India didn't grant immediate recognition, reportedly not wanting to provoke Pakistan further or be seen as interfering too directly initially.
But tensions were high.
Extremely high.
Yeah.
Diplomatic tensions escalated with incidents like the defection of the Pakistani Deputy High Commissioner and his staff in Calcutta, who declared themselves the Bangladesh Mission. India also faced difficulties getting its own diplomatic staff safely out of Dhaka. Meanwhile, Bengali youth formed the Mukti Bahini, the Liberation Army, to fight the Pakistani forces. Pakistan, in turn, accused India of orchestrating the entire rebellion and sending Indian troops disguised as Mukti Bahini fighters.
What was India's diplomatic strategy?
Indian Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi reached out to major world powers, urging them to pressure Pakistan to stop the military action, find a political solution, and create conditions for the refugees to return safely. She undertook visits to Western capitals.
Were these visits successful?
Reportedly not very fruitful. The United States, in particular, made its position quite clear. If war broke out between India and Pakistan, even if China intervened to support Pakistan, India should not expect any aid from the U.S.
And Pakistan was making threats.
Yes, Pakistan's President Yahya Khan repeatedly threatened war if India continued to support the Bengali rebels, warning that Pakistan would not be alone in such a conflict, clearly hinting at support from the U.S. and China.
So faced with a massive refugee crisis, Pakistani threats, and a lack of support from the West, India felt it needed a strong ally.
Exactly. The source states India had to seek some powerful friend.
And that friend turned out to be the Soviet Union, formalized in the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation signed in August 1971.
That's right. By April 1971, the Soviet Union had reportedly already shifted its stance, abandoning its previous policy of trying to maintain simultaneous friendship with both India and Pakistan. Soviet President Podgorny had even written to Yahi Khan in early April, expressing great alarm at the military crackdown in East Pakistan and appealing for a peaceful solution.
But Pakistan wasn't listening.
Apparently not. Pakistan felt confident, the source suggests, of American and Chinese support. Yahi Khan dismissed the Bengali movement supporters as anti-national and unpatriotic. Meanwhile, India's situation, with 10 million refugees by August 1971, was becoming unbearable.
So the treaty was signed. What were its key provisions?
It was a comprehensive treaty. Key points included affirming enduring peace and friendship, mutual respect for independence and territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs. But the most crucial part, the all-important provision, as the source calls it, was Article 9.
What did Article 9 say?
It stipulated that neither country would enter into or participate in any military alliance directed against the other party. They undertook to abstain from any aggression against the other and not to provide any assistance to any third party engaged in armed conflict with the other. Crucially, it also stated they would immediately enter into mutual consultations in the event of an attack or threat of attack on either party to remove such threat and ensure peace and security.
A de facto security guarantee.
Pretty much. It wasn't a formal military alliance in the NATO sense, but it provided a strong security understanding.
What was the impact of this treaty?
According to the source, it generated confidence in India that it would be able to face any Pakistani challenge. While some saw it as a sort of a compromise with strict non-alignment, it was considered essential given the dire circumstances. It significantly raised India's prestige in diplomatic circles and was seen as a definite setback to Pakistan, China, and the United States, who had perhaps hoped to isolate India.
The source quotes VP Dutt again on this.
Yes, stating that Soviet backing became crucial for warding off the most serious threat to India's integrity and socioeconomic polity at that critical juncture.
So with millions of refugees still in India, the civil war raging in East Pakistan, Pakistani threats continuing, and India now backed by the Soviet treaty, the situation was incredibly explosive.
Absolutely primed for war. Formal war began on December 4, 1971, according to a Pakistani notification cited by the source. But the reality was that border clashes had already escalated sharply in the weeks prior, especially in the eastern sector, involving tanks and aircraft. War was clearly in sight well before the formal declaration.
How did the full-scale war begin?
On the evening of December 3rd, Pakistan launched attacks on India's western border, hitting Indian posts in Kashmir. More significantly, the Pakistani Air Force conducted preemptive airstrikes, bombing 10 Indian Air Force stations across northern India from Srinagar all the way down to Agra.
Were the airstrikes effective?
India had apparently anticipated such a move, and aircraft had been moved, minimizing the damage. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi rushed back to Delhi. A state of emergency was declared, and Indian authorities decided it was time to destroy Pakistan's war machinery.
India launched counteroffensives.
Yes, Indian Army units were directed to move into East Pakistan to support the Mukti Bahini. And on the night of December 3rd, the Indian Air Force launched retaliatory strikes against Pakistani Air Force bases, reportedly causing heavy damage.
Pakistan's president, Yahi Khan, had called it the last and decisive war.
And decisive it was, the source agrees, but decisively for India. The war lasted just under 2 weeks until December 16, 1971.
Did the U.S. or China intervene, as Pakistan might have hoped?
No. The source mentions U.S. President Nixon ordering the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal, interpreting this as an attempt to bully India with the threat of a nuclear attack. However, the source emphasizes that, in view of Indo-Soviet Treaty, neither China nor USA intervened. Pakistan received only moral support and had to rely on its conventional weapons, suffering heavy losses on both the eastern and western fronts.
The war culminated dramatically in East Pakistan.
Yes, with the surrender of Pakistani forces there. Lieutenant General Niazi commanded the Pakistani troops in East Pakistan, which is now being called Bangladesh, facing India's Lieutenant General J.S. Arora, commanding the joint Indian and Mukti Bahini forces. Pakistani army morale reportedly collapsed by December 15th. Niazi initially hesitated but eventually sent a message requesting a ceasefire late that day.
And India's response?
India demanded unconditional surrender. Niazi accepted. On December 16, 1971, General Niazi formally surrendered unconditionally to General Arora in a public ceremony in Dhaka.
A huge number of Pakistani soldiers became POWs.
Yes, about 93,000 Pakistani military personnel surrendered in the east and were subsequently brought to India as prisoners of war.
After the surrender in the east, what happened on the Western Front?
India took a significant unilateral step. On the night of December 16th, just hours after the surrender in Dhaka, India announced a unilateral ceasefire in the western sector as well. Bangladesh was now a reality.
How did Pakistan react to the ceasefire offer?
Even though Yahya Khan was still making defiant statements about fighting on, he accepted the ceasefire within hours, reportedly acknowledging that war was no solution. The source notes that the U.S. claimed credit for the ceasefire, suggesting it pressured India via the Soviets, but India denied this.
Was India's unilateral ceasefire decision popular domestically?
Not universally. The source mentions it was criticized internally by some who felt the Indian army was on the verge of inflicting total defeat on Pakistan in the West, suggesting this was perhaps another instance where Pakistan was saved of a humiliating defeat by a ceasefire.
So, the primary outcome of the 1971 war, the division of Pakistan and the creation of the sovereign state of Bangladesh.
Which India recognized in December 1971. Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was eventually released from prison in Pakistan after power transferred from Yahya Khan to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who the source notes took credit for the release. On his way home to Dhaka, Mujib stopped in Delhi to publicly thank India and Mrs. Gandhi for their role in Bangladesh's independence.
This dramatic redrawing of the map led to the next major diplomatic effort, the Shimla Accord.
Yes. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto took office in Pakistan in December 1971, becoming president and chief martial law administrator. He inherited what the source starkly calls a mutilated Pakistan. After several months of diplomatic groundwork, the India-Pakistan summit was held in Shimla, India at the end of June 1972.
Attended by
India's Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi and Pakistan's President Zia Bhutto, along with high-level delegations from both sides. They had complex and extensive discussions covering all the issues arising from the war, as well as the future of bilateral relations.
What were the key issues on the table?
Major issues included the repatriation of the nearly 93,000 Pakistani POWs held by India, Pakistan's recognition of Bangladesh, which was linked to the POW issue, restoration of normal diplomatic relations, resuming trade, and, critically, the fixation of the boundary line in Kashmir.
And the outcome.
After prolonged, reportedly difficult negotiations, Bhutto agreed on what the source describes as essentially a bilateral approach to settling India-Pakistan issues. The Shimla Accord was signed, committing both countries to work towards ending conflict and disputes and pledging lasting friendship.
What were the key agreements within the Shimla Accord? They seem pivotal.
Absolutely pivotal. First, they agreed to seek peaceful solutions to all their disputes and problems only through bilateral negotiations, no third-party involvement. And crucially, the text stated neither India nor Pakistan would unilaterally alter the existing situation.
A commitment to the status quo pending bilateral resolution.
That's how it's often interpreted. They also pledged not to use force against each other, not to violate territorial integrity, and not to interfere in each other's political freedom or internal affairs.
Were there specific steps agreed for normalization?
Yes. Familiar themes. Discourage hostile propaganda, encourage friendly news dissemination, and concrete steps like reestablishing communication links, postal, telegraphic, sea, land, air, providing travel facilities to promote people-to-people contact, reestablishing trade and economic cooperation as far as possible, and promoting exchanges in science and culture.
And specific measures related to the recent conflict in borders.
Yes, in the interest of durable peace, they agreed that armies would return to their respective sides of the international border. In Jammu and Kashmir, they agreed that both countries would respect the line of control as it resulted from the ceasefire of December 17, 1971. Neither side was to seek to alter it unilaterally, irrespective of mutual differences. Armies were to withdraw from territories captured across this line as well within 20 days.
How was the Shimla Accord viewed in India? Was it universally praised?
No, it faced criticism. Some critics saw it as a surrender, particularly because India withdrew troops from the Pakistani territory it had captured during the war, without getting a final settlement on Kashmir in return.
But the source highlights the core value of the agreement.
Yes, It emphasizes that the value of Shimla Agreement lies in the commitment of two countries to resolve all their disputes only through bilateral negotiations. This principle, if adhered to, meant the Kashmir dispute would not be internationalized, placing the responsibility squarely on direct talks between Delhi and Islamabad.
And the source mentions a potential hidden understanding.
It notes a widely held belief at the time and since that perhaps an unstated understanding was reached between Gandhi and Bhutto on settling the Kashmir problem based on the existing line of control, possibly making it the de facto international border with some minor adjustments. The thinking, according to the view, was that Bhutto couldn't commit to this publicly right then and needed time to prepare Pakistani public opinion.
What about the Pakistani POWs? Their return was linked to Bangladesh.
Yes, their repatriation was linked to Pakistan formally recognizing Bangladesh, as Bangladesh's agreement was needed, especially regarding POWs accused of war crimes. Pakistan eventually recognized Bangladesh in February 1974, reportedly after an appeal at an Islamic summit. The over 90,000 POWs were finally returned in late 1973 and 1974, following a tripartite agreement between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in August 1974, which sorted out the details, including the handover of 195 POWs wanted for war crimes trials, after Pakistan issued a statement condemning war crimes.
So, from Pakistan's perspective, what were the gains from Shimla, according to the source?
The source suggests Bhutto managed to recover the West Pakistani territory lost in the war, secured a line of control in Kashmir that did not hurt him politically at home, and got all the POWs back without making much concession on the core issue of Kashmir itself.
Now, despite Shimla's commitment to bilateralism, did Pakistan stop raising the Kashmir issue internationally?
According to the source, no, not at all. It explicitly states that Pakistan was not deterred and continued to raise the Kashmir issue in various international forums, NAM, UN bodies, the Commonwealth, SAARC summits, though these attempts proved futile in changing the status quo or garnering significant international intervention.
Relations seemed to worsen again fairly quickly with India's nuclear test in 1974.
Yes, the adversarial relations worsened. India conducted its first nuclear test in May 1974 in the Rajasthan desert. India termed it a peaceful nuclear explosion, PNE, intended for peaceful applications like mining or excavation, but it clearly demonstrated India's capability to build a nuclear bomb if it chose to.
How did Pakistan react?
Pakistan's Prime Minister Zia Bhutto was reportedly shocked and strongly critical, calling it nuclear blackmail. He declared that India's test had ended any possibility of agreeing to a no-war pact. India, for its part, insisted its nuclear program was purely for peaceful purposes and continued to call on existing nuclear powers to destroy their own weapons.
Pakistan itself saw a major political upheaval just a few years later in 1977.
Yes, Zia Bhutto was overthrown in a military coup led by his army chief, General Zia-ul-Haq. Zia ruled Pakistan as president for over a decade, repeatedly promising and postponing elections. Bhutto was eventually put on trial and hanged in 1979. Democracy was only restored in Pakistan after Zia himself was killed in a mysterious plane crash in 1988.
Was there any improvement in India-Pakistan relations during the brief non-Congress government in India in the late 70s?
Yes, there was a noticeable, albeit temporary, thaw. The Janata Party government, under Prime Minister Morarji Desai, 1977 to 79, made significant efforts to improve relations with neighbors, particularly Pakistan. The source notes several welcome gestures from both sides during this period.
And a specific visit is highlighted?
Yes, the visit of India's then Foreign Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee to Pakistan in 1978 is described as highly successful. It apparently broke the ice, and the source even quotes Pakistani sources acknowledging that relations had never been better than during that brief window.
However, the overall impact of the Long Zia regime on relations was quite negative, according to the source.
Very negative. During the subsequent tenures of Indira Gandhi from 1980 and Rajiv Gandhi 1984 to 89, India took several initiatives to improve ties, but the source claims the Zia regime cleverly avoided to build confidence.
And worse, the source accuses the Zia regime of actively destabilizing India.
Yes, it states quite strongly that it is, quote, widely believed that Zia regime took upon itself the task of destabilizing India by encouraging and assisting terrorism in Punjab for several years. It links this directly to the loss of thousands of innocent lives in Punjab during the 1980s, and even suggests a connection to Mrs. Gandhi's assassination in 1984 by her Sikh bodyguards. Direct negotiations between Rajiv Gandhi and Zia, and later with Benazir Bhutto after Zia's death, reportedly referred back to the Shimla Accord but yielded nothing concrete.
And the situation in Jammu and Kashmir itself took a very serious downturn in the late 1980s, coinciding with the end of the Zia era and return of democracy in Pakistan.
Yes, a very serious turn when, according to the source, Pakistan-sponsored insurgency disturbed peace in Jammu and Kashmir. The kidnapping of Rubina Saeed, the daughter of India's Union Home Minister Mufti Muhammad Saeed, in late 1989, is cited as the beginning of a prolonged and violent period of militancy in the state.
How bad did it get?
The source describes nearly 7 years, from 1990 to 1996, with no elected state government, a period where only the gun ruled the state, referring to both militants and security forces.
But elections were eventually held again in Kashmir.
Yes. Despite what the source calls Pakistan's efforts to disrupt them, voters came out for Lok Sabha, Indian parliament elections in 1996. J&K had no representation from 1991-96. Later that same year, state legislative assembly elections were held. The National Conference Party, led by Dr. Farooq Abdullah, won a majority and formed the government in October 1996, vowing to end militancy and ensure full autonomy for the state within the Indian Union.
What was the impact of this prolonged militancy on Kashmir itself, according to the source?
Devastating. The source states the economy was badly ruined. The vital tourist industry completely ceased, especially after incidents involving the kidnapping and killing of some foreign tourists. Local commercial activity was often at a standstill due to frequent strike calls by militant groups.
And the source has a strong view on Pakistan's motives.
It asserts that Pakistan has been interested only in chaos in Kashmir, not in the actual well-being and prosperity of Kashmir people. It points out that while Pakistan talked of protecting Muslims, the militancy killed many prominent Kashmiri Muslims, alongside a large number of non-Muslims.
And the impact on the Pandit community.
The source tragically highlights that thousands of Pandits, Kashmiri Hindus, fled from Kashmir and stayed as refugees in their own country, mostly in Jammu, Delhi, and other parts of India. A terrible displacement.
While this internal conflict was raging in Kashmir, what was happening with India's wider international relations?
Interestingly, during this period, relations between India and China and India and the United States reportedly considerably improved. The source specifically notes that India and China have realized that border disputes can be solved if approached realistically, suggesting a contrast with the approach to Pakistan.
In the mid-1990s, India tried a different approach towards its neighbors, didn't it? The Gujral Doctrine.
Yes, named after I.K. Gujral, who was first foreign minister and later prime minister. This doctrine involved India taking unilateral action to improve relations, essentially offering concessions and goodwill gestures without necessarily demanding immediate reciprocity from smaller neighbors. Gujral reportedly went virtually out of the way to try and build lasting peace in the region.
What was the driving force behind this, according to the source?
An awareness of the immense costs of the ongoing hostility with Pakistan, the dangerous nuclear standoff that was emerging, the huge armies draining scarce resources that could be used for development. The source quotes commentator Raj Chengappa, linking this hostility directly to poverty in the region.
Had previous talks been fruitful?
No. The source states that numerous bilateral talks held up until 1994 had borne no fruits. When a new initiative for foreign secretary-level talks was launched in March 1997, commentary quoted by the source was quite pessimistic, describing it as the same record played again and a dialogue of the deaf.
The core disagreements just weren't being bridged.
Exactly. The source reiterates the fundamental blocks. India, viewing Kashmir as legally part of its territory versus Pakistan, seeing it as disputed territory requiring a plebiscite. The ideological battle secularism versus the two-nation theory. And the diplomatic sequencing, Pakistan insisting Kashmir is the core issue to be solved first, while India advocated for normalization, trade, and confidence-building measures, CBMs, to create an atmosphere for tackling difficult issues like Kashmir later.
What about the idea of making the law off the border?
The source mentions that suggestion, even citing Dr. Farooq Abdullah mentioning it, but notes it remained politically allergic in both countries, with leaders fearing a public backlash.
So, under the Gujral Doctrine, India made some specific unilateral gestures towards Pakistan.
Yes, in March 1997, India announced several measures described as unilateral gestures of goodwill, aimed at easing relations and promoting people-to-people contact, even without immediate Pakistani reciprocation.
What kind of measures?
Easing visa restrictions for various categories of Pakistani nationals. Businessmen could get 1-year, multiple entry visas. Procedures were simplified for pilgrims and tourists. Certain groups like senior citizens, Students, journalists, and cultural groups were exempted from mandatory police reporting, and visa fees were waived. The idea was to encourage a freer flow of people, books, and journals. India also increased the number of religious shrines that Pakistani pilgrims could visit.
How did Gujral frame these steps?
He described them as an emblem of India's earnest desire for friendship and cooperation, a clear signal of intent from the Indian side.
How were these measures received in India?
Mixed reaction, according to the source. The opposition protested, demanding the release of Indian soldiers allegedly held in Pakistani jails first. However, the source notes, the Times of India newspaper praised the measures as imaginative, saying they showed the world India understood the trauma of divided families and contrasted it favorably with Pakistan's stricter approach.
But despite these friendly steps from India, did Pakistan's attitude change, according to the source?
Not really, no. The source maintains Pakistan's attitude remained hardline. It cites a speech by Pakistan's president, Farooq Laghari, in March 1997, where he reportedly called Kashmir a matter of Pakistan's survival, openly supported Kashmiri separatists, and called for help from Muslim countries against alleged repression and human rights violations by India. The source states this attitude was in line with its decades-old hate India policy.
And Pakistan's foreign minister at the time?
Gauhar Ayub Khan also reportedly pursued a hate India policy, trying to negate the Gujral doctrine, insisting Kashmir was the core issue, and repeating what the source calls parrot-like repeated allegations of human rights abuses by Indian forces. Although the source does note that Gauhar also seemed to tone down his public rhetoric specifically about Kashmir being the only issue after Gujral met Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif in May 1997.
Did that Gujral-Sharif meeting in May achieve much?
Not a great deal, apparently. The source says the 2-hour meeting didn't bear much fruit, but they did agree to continue the dialogue process and set up working groups to discuss specific issues.
The source does suggest there might have been some pressures pushing Pakistan towards at least considering CBMs despite its public stance.
Yes, it suggests the Pakistani leadership was becoming aware of its increasing Pakistani isolation in international community on Kashmir question, despite routine statements of support from bodies like the OIC or EU. There might have been a compulsion for Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to engage in some CBM.
Economic factors, too.
Possibly. The idea that normal economic relations with India could help Pakistan's struggling economy. And the source also mentions reported pressure from international funding agencies on Pakistan to reduce its high defense expenditure and build confidence with India. India, for its part, needed to keep the diplomatic initiative, consistent with the Gujral doctrine.
Was there any specific economic cooperation initiative explored around this time?
Yes, interestingly. In the spirit of SAARC regional cooperation, the source says India and Pakistan agreed in principle in 1997 that India would purchase 30,000 milliW of surplus hydropower, potentially available from the Indus River Basin in Pakistan.
That sounds significant.
It could have been. The World Bank had apparently asked Pakistan to share its surplus power, and there was talk of a SAARC power grid. India purchasing power from Pakistan could have been a major CBM, potentially helping political cooperation. But like many initiatives, it didn't seem to materialize then.
Okay, moving into the crucial period of the late 1990s, relations took another sharp downturn with the nuclear tests before a brief but ultimately ill-fated period of hopeful dialogue.
A very dramatic period. Both countries conducted nuclear tests in May 1998. India first, conducting 5 tests, followed shortly by Pakistan conducting 6 tests at Chagai Hills. This dramatically escalated tensions and led to international condemnation and economic sanctions, mainly imposed by the United States.
But despite the heightened tension, the hostility reportedly subsided somewhat later that year.
Yes, by the time Prime Ministers Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who had returned to power in India, and Nawaz Sharif met on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York in September 1998, things had cooled considerably.
And they agreed on some CBMs.
Yes, the source says the ice was broken at that meeting, and they initiated some informal CBMs. The most prominent agreement was to start a regular bus service between Delhi and Lahore, the idea being to facilitate easier and more economical travel for ordinary people between the two countries.
The source adds a little detail about how that bus idea came about.
Yeah, it apparently surfaced as a random thought at a luncheon meeting between Vajpayee and Sharif. The official account, the source notes, rejected media speculation that the U.S. Clinton administration was behind it, attributing the thaw instead to these innovative diplomatic initiatives by the leaders themselves.
Prime Minister Vajpayee's decision to actually travel on the inaugural bus journey on February 20 in 1999 was a huge symbolic gesture.
Massive. It was described as symbolic yet full of potential. It created, according to the source, nationwide euphoria in India, with widespread expectations that this could herald a new era in relations.
But there was also realism.
Yes, the source adds a note of caution. Nobody expected miracles, as Pakistan was not likely to give up its obsession with Kashmir after more than 50 years. He quotes strategic analyst K. Subramaniam suggesting India should just bear to live with Pakistani Kashmir rhetoric, hoping the two new nuclear states could learn to live as equals within a mutually beneficial framework.
But the source immediately foreshadows what happened next, doesn't it?
It does, very starkly. It states, explicitly attributing this view, but, as explained below, Pakistan did not make use of India's friendly gestures and committed aggression soon afterwards by occupying Kargil Heights on our side of line of control. A really jarring juxtaposition.
Did Vajpayee address Kashmir before the visit?
The source confirms he did. He admitted the Kashmir issue would definitely be discussed, referring back to the Shimla Agreement's provision for bilateral dialogue, and said, "We are ready for talks."
Were there mixed signals coming from Pakistan just before this historic bus journey?
Very mixed signals. While Indian media was generally hopeful, the source highlights that Pakistan's Foreign Minister Sartaj Aziz reportedly sent a highly negative signal just on the eve of the visit. He apparently launched a tirade against India, raising contentious issues like Kashmir, Siachen, Tobol, Sur Creek.
But then he welcomed the visit.
Remarkably, yes. The source notes that after delivering this criticism, Aziz concluded by saying, "It is in this spirit that we look forward to the forthcoming visit." He also reportedly told visiting Indian parliamentarians around the same time that unless we can move towards a settlement of the Kashmir dispute, peace will continue to elude South Asia. So a very conditional welcome.
What about the actual reception for Vajpayee in Lahore? Was it smooth?
Also described as mixed by the source. While Vajpayee received a warm official welcome at the Wagah border from PM Sharif, the source makes a point of noting that the 3 service chiefs of Pakistan did not attend the welcome ceremony.
A significant absence.
Seen as such, yes. There were also near-violent demonstrations by fundamentalist groups protesting the visit. Vajpayee made another significant gesture by visiting the Minar-e-Pakistan, a monument symbolizing Pakistan's creation, seen as countering Pakistani allegations that India hadn't reconciled to partition.
And the reaction to that visit?
The source recounts the disturbing detail that Pakistani fundamentalists later publicly washed the spot where Vajpayee had stood at the Minar to purify it. K.K. Katyal is quoted observing that while Sharif might have had army backing for the summit, the public and political mood was such that ordinary people weren't really involved in the welcome, even though the official level reception was marked by extreme warmth and cordiality.
Despite these troubling undercurrents, the summit culminated in the signing of the Lahore Declaration.
Yes, the famous Lahore Declaration, signed by the 2 prime ministers at the formal level. It reaffirmed their desire to open a new chapter, talked about a shared vision of peace and stability, progress and prosperity. It reiterated their determination to implement the Shimla Agreement in letter and spirit, and their commitment to the UN Charter and goals like nuclear disarmament.
Did it specifically mention Kashmir?
Yes. Critically, it stated the governments shall intensify their efforts to resolve all issues, including the issue of Jammu and Kashmir. They also pledged to refrain from intervention and interference in each other's internal affairs, intensify their Compass dialogue process, and reaffirmed their condemnation of terrorism in all forms.
What about the nuclear dimension, given the tests the previous year?
That was also addressed. They agreed on immediate steps for reducing the risk of accidental or unauthorized use of nuclear weapons. A separate Memorandum of Understanding, OEU, was signed by the foreign secretaries.
What was in there?
It emphasized bilateral consultations on security concepts and nuclear doctrines, and a very significant provision. They agreed to provide each other with advance notification of ballistic missile flight tests and to conclude a bilateral agreement on this. They also agreed to periodically review existing CBMs and set up consultative mechanisms.
How was this Lahore process received internationally?
Generally very well. Major global powers like the U.S., Russia, France, UK, Japan applauded the bus diplomacy and the declaration, encouraging the bilateral dialogue and confidence-building efforts. India's newspaper, The Hindu, is quoted complimenting the PMs for their commendable determination to tread a new path of reconciliation, but also wisely cautioning about the innumerable hurdles ahead, hinted at by the fundamentalist protests.
Prime Minister Vajpayee's own words in Lahore were quite poignant, weren't they? Both hopeful and cautionary.
Very much so. He assured Pakistan that India wouldn't be found wanting in taking bold steps to create an atmosphere for resolving issues. He called for enduring peace, famously quoting, "We can change history, but not geography. We can change our friends, but not neighbors."
But he also issued a warning.
Yes, the source highlights his caution that a little spark could result in disastrous consequences, stressing the absolute need for confidence and mutual trust. And then the source delivers the punchline. He proved to be so correct. The Kargil conflict begun by Pakistan soon after the Lahore visit proved disastrous to the Indo-Pak efforts for friendship.
Which brings us, inevitably and tragically, to the betrayal at Kargil in the summer of 1999.
Yes. The background here lies with the line of control, Lalti and Kashmir. As we discussed, this line emerged from the ceasefire at the end of the 1971 war and was formalized in the Shimla Agreement. Both armies agreed to respect it.
And it had been relatively stable.
Largely, yes. The source states for almost 27 years, the line of control was never violated in a major, overt way like this. Now, in the high-altitude areas like Kargil, there was an established practice on the Indian side. Troops would occupy strategic heights during the summer months, but withdraw to lower bases during the extremely harsh winter when heavy snowfall made the posts untenable. The bunkers would be left unmanned until the snow melted in late spring, when troops would return. This was done in the winter of 1998.
But during that winter of 1998-99, while the Lahore process was unfolding, Pakistan reportedly put a different plan into operation.
Yes, the source is incredibly direct and critical here. It states, while apparently Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was giving warm welcome to Prime Minister Vajpayee in Lahore, secretly Pakistani regulars and other intruders were busy occupying the Kargil heights on Indian side of line of control.
They took advantage of the winter vacation of posts.
Exactly. These intruders got themselves well entrenched on the Indian side of Laway, in some places penetrating up to 10 kilometers deep across a vast stretch of the Kargil sector, including areas like Dras and Batalik. This large-scale intrusion was officially discovered by India only in early May 1999.
And the Indian Army was ordered to evict them.
Yes, instructed to throw them out. But it wasn't easy. These were mountaintops at 15,000, 16,000 feet, still covered in snow. A very difficult military operation.
The source doesn't just call it aggression, does it?
No, it uses stronger language. It calls the Pakistani action not only an aggression against India, but was also treacherous. It directly quotes Prime Minister Vajpayee saying that while he took a message of goodwill to Lahore, Pakistan stabbed India at its back.
What were Pakistan's objectives in Kargil, according to the source's analysis?
It wasn't just about sitting on those heights. The primary aim was apparently to cut the vital Shedigarle Highway, which runs through Kargil, thereby cutting off Ladakh from the Kashmir Valley.
Strategic objectives beyond the immediate area.
Yes, the thinking, according to the source, was to build pressure on the overall Kashmir situation, perhaps encourage unrest and terror through increased militancy on the Indian side, and ultimately advance Pakistan's larger aim of capturing the entire state, or at least the valley. The source lists 4 immediate objectives Pakistan might have had. A. Internationalize the Kashmir issue again. B. Score a decisive military victory by capturing key locations. C. Foment trouble and unrest on the Indian side. And D. Perhaps win support from Muslims within India.
Did Pakistan achieve these objectives?
No. The source asserts quite firmly, Pakistan failed in this entire game plan. It credits the Indian Army with demonstrating unprecedented determination and courage in pushing back the intruders.
India launched a full-scale military response.
Yes. The Indian Army, strongly supported by the Indian Air Force, launched Operation Vijay, Operation Victory. And according to the source, they defeated the enemy decisively. While acknowledging initial intelligence failures on India's part, perhaps lulled by the Lahore process, the source quotes India Today magazine, stating that the Vajpayee government's tough response stunned Pakistan. Ordering IAF bombardments signaled India would take all necessary steps.
Did India cross the line of control?
No. Crucially, India maintained restraint in that regard, fighting only on its own side of the Lasi, which earned it international support. The message to the Pakistani intruders was clear: leave or be killed. The source notes, Indian forces kept their promise and killed those who did not run away.
And diplomatically?
The source concludes, Pakistan's diplomacy failed. India achieved highest level of diplomatic victory along with military success.
How did the rest of the world react to Kargil? Was it what Pakistan expected?
Apparently not. The international response was clearly against the expectations of the aggressor country. As the Indian military operation unfolded, almost every country saw through the sinister designs of Pakistan, realizing Pakistan had flagrantly violated the line of control by sending its forces across.
Did the world buy Pakistan's initial denial, claiming they were local freedom fighters?
No, the source states emphatically, no country bought the Pakistani argument that those who occupied the heights were Kashmiri Mujahideens, or freedom fighters. The source itself poses the rhetorical question: why would genuine freedom fighters occupy desolate, high-altitude snow bunkers in winter within their own state?
And India provided proof.
Yes, India produced what the source calls unimpeachable evidence, captured soldiers, documents, equipment, proving the heights were occupied by armed Pakistani regular troops in civilian clothes and other intruders fully trained and armed by Pakistan.
Even Pakistan's allies were convinced.
Apparently so. The source states that even Pakistan's closest allies, China and the United States, were convinced that it were Pakistanis who were in unlawful occupation on the Indian side of the Law Sea. International pressure mounted on Pakistan to vacate the aggression and restore the sanctity of the line of control. Pakistan reportedly persisted with the freedom fighters' narrative until the U.S. categorically told Pakistani leadership to withdraw its regulars and other intruders.
So Pakistan faced both military defeat on the ground and diplomatic isolation.
Completely. As Pakistani forces were already retreating under Indian military pressure, Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif made a sudden dash to Washington, D.C., which the source sees as a desperate attempt to salvage the situation.
And his meeting with President Clinton.
U.S. President Clinton took the unusual step of meeting Sharif on America's Independence Day, July 4th, 1999. The source highlights this moment, stating it was the first time in 5 decades when the United States gave to India political support on any major issue concerning national security, a significant shift.
Was this seen as U.S. mediation?
India immediately sought to dispel any such impression, and the source notes the Americans themselves made it clear they were not mediating.
So Pakistan was isolated.
The source states, Pakistan had never before been so clearly isolated, and India had never before received such universal support on a core security issue. Friendless and defeated, Pakistan had to vacate every inch of Indian territory it had occupied, either regained by Indian forces or abandoned under pressure.
A clear victory for India.
India achieved a political, diplomatic, military victory. The source praises the Indian armed forces for showing exemplary, sometimes suicidal courage. While the cost was high for India, the source cites over 400 soldiers killed and over 500 wounded, and an estimated financial cost exceeding Rs 5,000 crores. The outcome was seen as Pakistan's humiliating military defeat.
What was Clinton's message to Sharif?
Clinton's directive was reportedly clear. Withdraw Pakistani forces from the Kargil area immediately, respect the Law Sea, and initiate direct negotiations with India to resolve issues. The U.S. clearly ruled out any mediation. Sharif's only ray of hope, according to the source, was a vague assurance from Clinton of taking personal interest in encouraging dialogue after normalcy was restored, which the source stresses certainly was neither an offer of help nor of mediation. Pakistan was forced to make a complete turnaround and suffer a diplomatic snub.
After the Kargil conflict ended with Pakistan's withdrawal, did the situation stabilize? What about cross-border terrorism?
No, unfortunately. According to the source, cross-border terrorism against India actually escalated and assumed new dimensions after Kargil. It became very active, particularly in J&K, and militants even attacked military posts inside India.
And there was a major hijacking incident.
Yes. In December 1999, Indian Airlines flight IC-814, flying from Kathmandu to Delhi, was hijacked by 5 heavily armed men. The plane was eventually flown to Kandahar in Afghanistan, which was then under the control of the Taliban, who were supported by Pakistan.
How did that end?
Over 150 passengers and crew were held hostage for 7 harrowing days. They were released only when the Indian government agreed to release 3 high-profile militants from Indian jails. The source notes the hijackers were identified as Pakistani nationals who managed to return to Pakistan afterwards, and India possessed enough evidence of Pakistan's intelligence agency ISI involvement, which further spoiled India-Pakistan relations.
And then, just a few months after Kargil, Pakistan saw another military coup in October 1999.
That's right. Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif attempted to dismiss his army chief, General Pervez Musharraf, while Musharraf was out of the country. The army immediately revolted in support of their chief. Musharraf returned, announced the dismissal of Sharif and his government, placed Sharif under house arrest, and took control of the country, declaring himself chief executive.
The 4th military coup in Pakistan's history.
Yes, this was naturally a matter of serious concern for India, especially given the army's perceived role in the Kargil conflict. The U.S. also expressed unease. Sharif was later tried, sentenced, and eventually exiled.
And the source directly links Musharraf to the failure of the Lahore Peace Initiative.
Yes, it explicitly states, attributing this view, Prime Minister Vajpayee's Lahore Initiative had been destroyed by Musharraf as Chief of Army Staff of Pakistan. It then describes Vajpayee's later decision to invite Musharraf himself for talks as another gamble, which again met with Pakistani leaders' adamant and provocative attitude.
There's a quote from C. Raja Mohan again.
Yes, suggesting Vajpayee thought he was being generous with hospitality and substance, but the swaggering general saw this generosity as weakness and was determined to get a return on the Pakistani army's long investment in bleeding India and Kashmir. Vajpayee's peace initiative, Mohan concludes, turned to ashes.
Then came the event that shifted the global landscape, the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the United States in September 2001.
A massive terrorist strike that killed thousands. U.S. intelligence quickly concluded that al-Qaeda, the terrorist group led by Osama bin Laden and based in Afghanistan, was responsible.
And the source points out Pakistan's connection.
Yes, it notes al-Qaeda was earlier sheltered and supported by Pakistan, and the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which harbored al-Qaeda, was trained by Pakistan initially and remained closely allied with Islamabad.
How did the U.S. respond?
President George W. Bush decided to attack the Taliban and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. He sought and received full support from Pakistan President Musharraf. The source offers this analysis. Pakistan was the creator of Taliban and had been ignored by Clinton administration. Musharraf grabbed the opportunity of winning over the support and friendship of the United States. Pakistan provided crucial logistical and intelligence assistance for the U.S.-led operation in Afghanistan.
What was the outcome of that operation?
The Taliban regime was overthrown relatively quickly, within about 2 months, October-December 2001. However, key leaders, including Osama bin Laden, escaped capture at that time. Afghanistan was apparently freed from Taliban rule, at least for a while.
But the source sees Pakistan as the main beneficiary of 9/11.
That's its clear assessment. In the process, Pakistan was the biggest beneficiary. Why? Because by becoming a key U.S. ally in the war on terror, Musharraf gained international legitimacy and significant U.S. aid, despite Pakistan's history with the Taliban. And, the source argues, Pakistan was emboldened and cross-border terrorism against India was increased so much that India had to prepare itself for a war against Pakistan. A very critical take on the consequences.
So the source argues the Lahore Declaration was effectively dead by this point.
Yes, torn into pieces by the new military ruler of Pakistan. With cross-border terrorism reportedly remaining unabated, India initially adopted a position of refusing dialogue. It would not talk to Pakistan until democracy was restored in that country.
But Musharraf kept pushing for talks.
Yes, he kept on harping on dialogue, specifically focusing on resolving the core issue of Kashmir, while, according to the source, international pressure was mounted on India to initiate talk with the troublesome neighbor.
Despite India's initial reluctance to engage with a military ruler, Prime Minister Vajpayee took another chance, didn't he? He invited Musharraf for a summit.
Yes. Setting aside the earlier opposition, Vajpayee invited General Musharraf for talks. This was Vajpayee's second gamble after Lahore. The summit was held in Agra in July 2001.
And Musharraf had solidified his position by then.
Just before the visit, Musharraf, who was already chief executive and army chief, had the incumbent president resign and assumed the presidency himself. So he arrived in India as President Musharraf.
What was the atmosphere?
He received a warm welcome, and there was significant media hype again, hoping for a breakthrough, a new chapter.
But the talks themselves, held in Agra, were difficult.
Extremely difficult, by all accounts. Musharraf reportedly insisted on right of self-determination for the people of Jammu and Kashmir, denied by India. He consistently focused on Kashmir as the core issue and harped on repression of the people of state by India.
And his stance on cross-border terrorism.
The source is very clear. He refused to accept that there was any cross-border terrorism from Pakistani side. He even told Indian hosts and the media, in interactions that were directly telecast, that the violence occurring in Kashmir was nothing but freedom struggle by suppressed people. This framing was, according to the source, totally untrue and unacceptable to India.
So the talks failed.
Completely. No joint declaration could be issued. The source quotes C. Raja Mohan again, vividly describing July 2001 as possibly the cruelest month Atal Bihari Vajpayee ever endured, realizing after days and nights of talks that his attempt at a breakthrough had collapsed yet again.
Why couldn't they even agree on a joint statement?
The Indian PM refused to sign. Musharraf reportedly destroyed draft in his press conference by publicly reiterating positions unacceptable to India, blaming India for 1971, accusing India of suppression in Kashmir, denying Pakistan's role in terrorism, and framing militants as freedom fighters. Raja Mohan suggests Musharraf overplayed his hand and undermined the prospects for a broad agreement, forcing Vajpayee's hand.
What happened after the failure at Agra? Did terrorism decrease?
No, the source states, after Agra, terrorism did not stop. It continued, with a large number of innocent people and security forces being killed. It mentions the car bomb attempt on the Kashmir State Secretariat in Srinagar in October 2001.
And then came the devastating attack on India's parliament in Delhi.
Yes, the source describes this as the worst happened on December 13, 2001. 5 very well-armed terrorists, identified by the source as all Pakistani nationals, attempted to storm the Parliament House complex while Parliament was in session.
But they were stopped.
Yes. Alert security personnel challenged them, leading to a fierce gun battle within the complex grounds. All 5 terrorists were killed, one reportedly being a suicide bomber. Tragically, 7 brave Indian security personnel, including a policewoman, lost their lives protecting the Parliament building and the country's top political leadership inside.
Pakistan's reaction?
The source states there was clear proof of the terrorists being Pakistani nationals, yet Pakistan shamelessly called them Kashmiri freedom fighters. Arrests made in Delhi provided evidence linking the plotters to Pakistan-based groups, but Pakistan reportedly refused to claim the bodies of the killed terrorists, just as it had refused to accept the bodies of its soldiers during Kargil. India saw this attack as an unacceptable, direct threat to its democracy.
What was India's response to the parliament attack?
India took several strong diplomatic and logistical measures. It withdrew its High Commissioner from Islamabad and asked Pakistan to recall its Deputy High Commissioner, Jilani, whose involvement in funding terrorists was allegedly established. India banned Pakistani aircraft from flying over Indian airspace and canceled its own flights using Pakistani airspace. The Delhi-Lahore bus service and the Samshada Express train service were suspended.
And militarily?
Crucially, India mobilized its troops on the international border as well as the line of control. Pakistan, too, mobilized its troops. This led to a prolonged and extremely tense military standoff.
How close did they come to war?
By the summer of 2002, a war between the two neighbors appeared imminent. It was a very dangerous period, with huge numbers of troops deployed eyeball to eyeball along the border for months. Eventually, due to intense international concern and slight improvement in environment, India decided to withdraw its forces from their forward positions after about 10 months of mobilization.
But even during this tense military standoff, did the cross-border attacks stop?
No, according to the source. Even when the two armies stood face to face, Pakistan-sponsored terrorism kept bleeding innocent Indians. It mentions major attacks during this period, like the one on the Akshardham Temple complex in Ahmedabad and another on the Raghunath Temple in Jammu, where terrorists were eventually killed by security forces after causing casualties. It also mentions foil plots in Delhi and intelligence reports about plans to target top leaders and landmarks.
Amidst all this violence and tension, the source highlights the J&K elections held in 2002 as significant. Why?
Because free and fair state assembly elections were conducted in Jammu and Kashmir in October 2002, despite, as the source puts it, massive Pakistan propaganda urging a boycott, and despite threats and violence from militant groups aimed at disrupting the polls.
Did people vote?
Yes, the source knows people braved all threats and came out in large numbers to vote. And importantly, the international community all over acclaimed the fairness of the elections. People voted freely, without fear, and actually changed the state government through the ballot box.
How did India interpret this turnout?
It was seen as willing participation of people in democratic process, giving a lie to Pakistani propaganda that the right of self-determination was being denied to the people of the state. Prime Minister Vajpayee used this exact point effectively on the international stage.
How so?
At the Non-Aligned Movement NAM Summit in Kuala Lumpur in February 2003, he directly countered President Musharraf's parrot-like allegation, the source's term, of suppression and denial of rights by pointing to the recent free elections as proof of the determination and self-determination of the Kashmiri people choosing their government within the Indian democratic framework. He reiterated this point at the UN General Assembly later that year.
Was the international community also putting pressure on Pakistan regarding terrorism by this time?
Yes. The source suggests world leaders were increasingly, directly or indirectly, condemning the cross-border terrorism originating from Pakistan. It specifically mentions Russian President Putin during a visit to Delhi in December 2002, directly calling upon Pakistan to end cross-border terrorism in a joint declaration. Other countries like France, Germany, and Vietnam were also reportedly seeing the reality of the terror directed against India.
Even the name summit.
The NAM summit in 2003 deplored the proxy war and significantly refused to endorse Pakistani president's argument that freedom struggle must be distinguished from terrorism. The U.S. ambassador to India at the time, Robert Blackwell, is quoted stating militancy from across the border was continuing and must end. President Bush himself reportedly told Musharraf directly to stop terrorism against both India and Afghanistan. Even Afghan President Hamid Karzai was critical of continued Taliban support emanating from Pakistan.
So despite the failure at Agra, the parliament attack, the military standoff, and continued terrorism, Prime Minister Vajpayee made yet another peace overture in 2003.
Yes, his third major initiative. The source describes India as being always keen for friendship with Pakistan. During a visit to Srinagar in Kashmir in April 2003, Vajpayee once again extended his hand of friendship.
What did India offer this time?
India agreed to exchange high commissioners again. Diplomatic ties had been downgraded after the parliament attack. Further encouraged people-to-people contact by improving visa facilities, reintroduce the Delhi-Lahore bus service, and initiate dialogue for resuming overflights.
How did Pakistan respond to these steps?
The response was apparently lukewarm or problematic. The source states, but Pakistan created difficulties in resumption of overflights. And more fundamentally, Pakistan did not stop harping on denial of rights to the people of Kashmir, nor did the cross-border terrorism stop. India reportedly felt disgusted and disappointed yet again.
Vajpayee expressed this frustration publicly.
Yes, very clearly. At the UN General Assembly in September 2003, he delivered a strong message to the international community, stating India would not talk to the terror. He drew a parallel, asking why the world expected India to talk to the sponsors of terrorism when the world didn't negotiate with al-Qaeda or the Taliban before taking action against them. He declared India would talk to Pakistan on other issues only after cross-border terrorism ended definitively, or, using his words, after we crush this. The source concludes Vajpayee's third peace initiative also appeared to be heading to yet another roadblock.
However, things seemed to shift again slightly with the SAARC summit in Islamabad in January 2004.
Yes, on the sidelines of that summit, Vajpayee and Musharraf issued a joint statement on January 6, 2004, pledging to renew the stalled peace process and the composite dialogue.
And the new Indian government under Dr. Manmohan Singh, which came to power later in 2004, continued this effort.
Vigorously, according to the source. The UPA government pursued normalization vigorously. It initiated several more measures for people-to-people contact and aimed at resolving outstanding problems, including Kashmir. Dr. Singh and President Musharraf held several meetings, including on the sidelines of the UNGA and during Musharraf's visit to India for cricket diplomacy in April 2005.
Were there concrete results from these renewed efforts?
Dr. Singh reported to the Indian Parliament that good progress was being made on confidence-building measures, people-to-people contacts, and enhancing areas of interactions. They agreed on enhancing bilateral economic and commercial cooperation.
Any specific connectivity projects?
Yes, they agreed to restore the Kokapur-Mumbai rail link across the Rajasthan-Sindh border, which would primarily help divided families visit relatives, but also boost trade. And perhaps most symbolically, the Srinagar-Muzaffarabad bus service was finally started in April 2005, linking the capital of Indian-administered J&K with the capital of Pakistan-occupied Kashmir across the Lozi for the first time in decades.
While dialogue was ongoing, Pakistan continued to push for a resolution of the Kashmir issue, and Musharraf proposed specific ideas.
Yes, Pakistan always insisted on resolving Kashmir. President Musharraf, during this period, apparently floated suggestions involving a division of the state based on religion using the Tehsil, a local administrative unit, as the basis. His idea seemed to involve grouping Muslim-majority Tehsils of the Kashmir Valley and Jammu region into one unit, while Hindu-majority Tehsils of Jammu and Buddhist-majority Tehsils of Ladakh would form separate units.
How did the source characterize this proposal?
It calls it another partition of the state on communal lines, notes it was totally unacceptable to India and was rejected.
And Prime Minister Manmohan Singh's stance was clear.
Yes, he reportedly made it clear to Musharraf that any redrawing of boundaries or further partition based on religion was out of the question.
Now, despite all these high-level meetings, CBMs, and the ongoing composite dialogue, did the cross-border terrorism stop?
No. The source highlights a striking allegation made by the deposed Pakistani PM Nawaz Sharif in 2006. He claimed that Musharraf, when he was army chief during Kargil in 1999, had deployed nuclear weapons against India without the prime minister's knowledge or consent, something Sharif said he learned from President Clinton. The source uses this to state it was hard to trust Musharraf. More broadly, despite the commitment Musharraf gave to Vajpayee in January 2004 not to allow Pakistani territory to be used for terrorism, the source states emphatically cross-border terrorism continued unabated.
Targeting places beyond Kashmir.
Yes, major attacks occurred in Delhi, like the serial blasts on Diwali Eve in 2005, Mumbai, the horrific serial bombings on local trains on July 11, 2006, and Varanasi. These attacks reportedly had a devastating effect on the peace process. Adding to the tension was the expulsion of an Indian diplomat from Pakistan in August 2006, seen by India as unjustified.
How did Pakistan explain the continuation of militancy while peace talks were supposedly ongoing?
The source finds Pakistan's justification quite contradictory and revealing. It states, somewhat surprisingly, that President Musharraf and his Foreign Minister Kazuri have been arguing that until the Kashmir dispute was resolved, meaning until Pakistan got Kashmir, militancy could not be checked.
So, linking terrorism directly to the Kashmir issue.
Yes, the source points out the contradiction. On one hand, Pakistan denied hand in terror activities. On the other hand, Pakistan implied that continuation of terrorism against India would end only if Kashmir issue is solved. The source concludes this argument is enough to convince the impartial observers that terror in India had direct links and roots in Pakistan.
A peculiar situation, as the source calls it. The formal peace process, the composite dialogue covering various issues, wasn't officially abandoned. Yet, terrorism emanating from Pakistan was not being stopped or destroyed by the Pakistani state.
How did India react to the Mumbai train bombings? India postponed the scheduled foreign secretary-level talks, a significant step, but notably without calling off the entire peace process. However, public anger in India reportedly forced the government to take a very tough stance on the question of terrorism.
Pakistan continued to ask for proof.
Yes, President Musharraf asked for proof of Pakistani agencies' role in the Mumbai bombings. Yet the source counters India had on a number of occasions in the past provided proof of continued terrorist training camps in Pakistan and POK, with little evidence of Pakistan taking concrete steps to dismantle this infrastructure or end the cross-border attacks.
So the composite dialogue covering a whole range of issues remains stuck.
Largely, yes. The dialogue included topics like Kashmir, peace and security, including CBMs, demilitarization of the Siachen Glacier, demarcation of the Sur Creek maritime boundary, terrorism, economic cooperation, border issues, the Total Navigation Project, etc. But the source states, just as Kashmir issue eluded a settlement, the other lesser important problems also remained unsolved.
What was the root cause of the stalemate, according to the source?
Pakistan's insistence on the solution of core issue of Kashmir and its alleged support to terrorism were seen as being at the root of continued stalemate, despite all the CBMs and India's repeated attempts at initiating peace.
The source offers some final concluding observations on the overall nature of this relationship, drawing things together.
Yes, it describes the India-Pakistan relationship as far more adversarial than either country's relationship with any other nation. It quotes commentator Pran Chopra, stating that the gulf between them was made deeper and wider since 1990 by a new poison entering the Kashmir dispute, which seems to refer to the rise of intense, externally sponsored militancy and terrorism becoming central to the conflict.
And the impact on Kashmir itself is reiterated.
Yes, the devastating impact. Economy ruined by militancy, tourism collapsing, commerce stalled. The source repeats its assertion that Pakistan was interested only in chaos, not Kashmiri well-being, citing the killing of both Muslims and non-Muslims by militants and the tragic flight of the Pandits. It also briefly contrasts this situation again with the improvement India saw in its relations with China and the U.S., and the apparent realization with China that even complex border disputes could be resolved if approached realistically.
Wow. We've really covered a vast and complex history today. We've traced the relationship between India and Pakistan right from the painful moment of partition, through decades marked by repeated conflict, cycles of tentative peace efforts, and these persistent fundamental disagreements.
It's a history absolutely defined by the incredibly complex legacy of that division, hasn't it? Unresolved territorial claims, particularly Kashmir, and this deep underlying ideological clash. The source material we looked at provided a really stark, detailed account of the specific events and the very different perspectives that has shaped this incredibly difficult relationship.
Yeah, we saw how the very creation of the two nations, the clash between the two-nation theory, underpinning Pakistan and India's commitment to secularism, laid a foundation of inherent tension right from day one.
And we looked at those immediate immense challenges, integrating the princely states like Junagadh and Hyderabad, dealing with the horrific human cost of partition and the refugee crisis, and even that rare instance of successful cooperation resolving the Indus Waters dispute through the 1960 treaty.
A rare positive note. But then we spent a lot of time delving deep into the Kashmir dispute, understanding its origins and partition politics, the Maharaja's indecision, the invasion, the failed attempts at international mediation, India's evolving legal and political stance solidified by the Constituent Assembly.
And Pakistan's persistent arguments, often framed as the source presented it by ideology, the two-nation theory, and perceived strategic needs. It really became the central, intractable issue.
And the source highlighted how Pakistan's foreign policy often seemed, certainly in the early decades, centered on this hostility towards India, leveraging external alliances, particularly with the U.S. and later China, sometimes leading directly to military conflict, as we saw in 1965.
Right. Then the 1971 war brought that dramatic shift, the creation of Bangladesh, radically altering the regional power balance. And the Shimla Accord followed, which, despite subsequent criticisms and interpretations, crucially enshrined that principle of resolving all disputes bilaterally between India and Pakistan alone.
A principle often invoked, but as the source made clear, not always adhered to in practice, especially by Pakistan continuing to raise Kashmir internationally. And the post-Shimla era saw renewed tensions, the nuclear tests, adding a dangerous new dimension.
And critically, the rise and intensification of what the source consistently described as Pakistan-sponsored insurgency and terrorism, first in Punjab and then devastatingly in Kashmir and elsewhere in India, escalating significantly after 1989 and particularly following the Kargil conflict.
Ah, Kargil. That really stood out in the source material as a stark example of betrayal, coming right after the Lahore Peace Initiative, underscoring how deeper strategic objectives, particularly perhaps within the Pakistani military establishment, seemed to override diplomatic efforts at that time.
Definitely. And the post-9/11 period, while globally significant, seemed, according to the source's analysis, to actually embolden Pakistan in some ways, leading to intensified cross-border terrorism against India, year war situations like the 2001-2002 standoff, and failed high-level talks like the Agra summit where the gap seemed unbridgeable.
Even the more recent peace efforts in the mid-2000s, with CBMs like bus services and trade talks, were constantly undermined, the source argues, by continued terrorism and Pakistan's leadership explicitly linking the cessation of militancy to a resolution of the Kashmir issue on its terms.
So the key takeaways from this deep dive seem pretty clear. That ideological battle over Kashmir, rooted in the partition, remains absolutely fundamental. External mediation has consistently faltered without strong, sustained bilateral political will. Cross-border terrorism has been a persistent, deeply damaging challenge, actively undermining peace efforts. And the human cost of this conflict, especially for the people living in Jammu and Kashmir, has been immense and ongoing.
So what does this incredibly complex, often quite painful history mean for you, listening today? Why should you care about these decades of conflict?
Well, understanding these roots, these dynamics, is absolutely essential if you want to comprehend the current geopolitical landscape of South Asia.
It reveals the really deep-seated challenges that continue to hinder regional stability and prosperity.
Exactly. It highlights how unresolved historical grievances, fundamental ideological divides, and critically, the use of non-state actors and proxy warfare can fuel ongoing tensions, making genuine cooperation and development in the region incredibly difficult. It really shows how deeply entrenched national narratives and positions, built up over decades of conflict, mutual suspicion, and loss, make finding a path towards genuine, lasting peace just extraordinarily difficult.
And that brings us to a final, maybe provocative thought, drawing directly from the source's observations. The source spoke of that new poison of terrorism entering the Kashmir dispute from the 1990s onwards, and it noted Pakistan's leadership explicitly linking the continuation of militancy to the unresolved Kashmir issue. So this leaves us with a really tough question to ponder.
Given this long, painful history of conflict cycles, of failed peace initiatives, and this persistent, undeniable challenge of cross-border terrorism, Can genuine sustainable peace between India and Pakistan ever truly take root if one side continues, implicitly or explicitly, to view militancy as a potential lever for negotiation?
Hmm.
Or if that fundamental ideological clash over the very idea of Kashmir remains, in essence, an unresolved, almost existential battle for both nations?
A question that unfortunately continues to hang very heavy over the subcontinent and indeed the world.
A complex history indeed.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.